Great. So what we should do, I think, for the presentation is it's going to be best, I think, for everybody if we have more of a discussion than a presentation. Because of the visual and auditory thing, if you have a question, kind of wave your hand and Katina, if you see somebody waving their hand, would you wave your hand too so I can, spot it? And we'll try and stop and take the questions and comments. Since a number of you said you were thinking of maybe doing something in the way of a startup or an entrepreneurial for-profit venture, I'll just mention that I had the good fortune in my career to start with a company that had just cracked 50 million. So it was probably 10 years from being a startup when I joined it, but it was still growing at 25% per year, 80% gross margins, and as such was a really dynamic, fast-growing company, and it was a great place to start. So it grew to $1 billion by the time I had left it and went on to my next career. And as part of that, one of the things that was important is really got to see what makes a good, strong, robust, sustainable business coming out of a startup, what things thwarted or hurt that process. So we can talk a little bit about that today if anybody wants to. Did two other stints in Fortune 500 companies. I'll mention that in each of them I ended up on the executive team, and then the last one was Chief Technology Officer for a company whose case study we're going to be using in the class today. Then did a couple .com startups here in the Bay Area. One was a software company developing software for in managing intellectual property. That was sold to Thompson, and then there's I did a professional services startup just to try something different in a career, and then since sold that. So, and then also by way of my background, so you can ask me questions, my son ended up then got a master's degree in urban planning, and he's now with the Bay Area planning group that does the regional planning for the 17 Bay Area cities that are part of the consortium. So have a little bit of a secondhand view of what it's like to be an urban planner and trying to do things like smart cities. So with that by way of background, let's go ahead and start. So I think my slide advanced. Did it advance for you?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thanks. So what we'll, the outline I thought we would do is I want to talk about some assumptions first, just so that we're all in the same place. Then because I'm going to be talking a lot about patents and how they can help in planning, whether it's planning for a company or planning for a city or government agency, how that's useful. I'm going to talk a little bit about the way patents affect development of technologies and industries. We'll go through the case study. It's the radio frequency identification tags that are used. Typically, if they're the dumber of the RFID tags are the ones that go off when you try and inadvertently walk out of a store with a garment or something of value from Home Depot. And then we're going to close with some a bit about what assumptions might be closer to theory, and then what are the conclusions. So I think my slide advanced to the assumptions.
Yes.
This is where, so this is what Paul believes and what I'm going to throw out as assumptions for you to consider. And I want you to look at those, and I want to debate these a little bit if there's any, if we need clear understanding or there's difference of views, so we might figure out a way to test it. So I believe that smart cities require the utilizations of patented technology systems likely to been developed by multiple parties. And that's just because I've studied patents and intellectual properties my whole career. I mentioned my first company had 80% gross margins. The only way we did that is we had heavily protected the technologies we commercialized. And what you see today at universities, and I suspect ASU is like the other, you've got a technology transfer office down there that's it's constantly checking with the professors to see if there's anything that's new and novel that they can acquire some rights to, and then make some licensing revenue for themselves. So that's something I just believe is an assumption going in. It's not going to be developed by open source people doing things to be nice. It's not going to be developed by nonprofits. It's going to be developed by people and lots of different viewpoints. The best case that I'm going to draw on it a little bit today is, how many of you are familiar with the smart home as an example? And you've got your,
Yes.
and any more than one hand, like your light switches, and you can talk to Siri or Google or Alexa, and you can have her turn off and on lights. You can have her change your temperature. You can have her change the security settings. You can, you know, all sorts of appliance stuff that can be done, and all sorts of inputs can be driven in terms of where you are in the house and what the smart home should be doing for you. So with respect to that, if you look at where that field is today, you know you've got Wemo, you know you've got Alexa systems, you know you've got Nest, you've got, you know, there's probably 20 different providers right now for your smart home. And you'll probably think a little bit about how are they working as a system. And the answer is not well. I mean, if I have Google and Alexa in the same home, and I ran this experiment for a long time along with Siri, it's really confusing when you sit there and Google will do some things for you, Alexa will do other things, and they won't talk to one another. And there's certain switches like Wemo that, although they can talk to one of those providers, they can't talk to both of them at the same time. Likewise, when I'm driving home in my car, I can't tell Siri to tell Alexa that I'm going to watch a movie when I get home, set the house up for that. Or if I'm down in my crash pad in San Diego, I can't tell Google that I'm flying home in the afternoon and I plan on playing the banjo when I get home, and have the house set up for that. So assumption number two, depending upon the relationships between the parties that have developed the technology, adoption of system-based solutions based on those technologies can be rapid and slow. And I'm just using the smart home thing now. This has been out for, you know, well, since its infancy over a decade, but popularly probably only the last 3 to 5 years. And today, it's still, you've got to pick one system or the other, and they don't play well together. And you look at the wars that are going on between Amazon and Google right now up here in the valley where I am. They're moving further apart rather than closer together. And the reason for mentioning that is that when we're talking about smart cities, if you're thinking about starting a business, or you're thinking about working in government as a planner or something like that, you really need to know how patents and intellectual property is working and how they interplay when you're forecasting which technological systems are going to be used and what the time frame their usage is going to be. I'm going to use a personal example from the late 1990s. That's 20 years ago. A number of the automobile companies, GM, Ford, Daimler from Mercedes, Chrysler, all had listening posts next to Stanford, which is close to me here. And in those laboratories, they were working on smart automobiles, which was really integrating with smart cities. They were trying to get it so the traffic lights in Sand Hill Boulevard, which is right going through downtown Palo Alto, they wanted to get those lights so they'd be timed better for traffic flow. And they were going to use RFID tags, and they were using vision systems and putting things together so these traffic lights would be able to see when the fire department had come out, when a policeman showed up, you know, when events happened, like Stanford was having a football game versus a normal Saturday when it wasn't, and try and control the traffic accordingly. Well, it's 20 years later. The technology really hasn't changed that much. All the technology was available 20 years ago to put in place a really smart traffic system, and yet it doesn't exist today. And so there again is my assumption that the city planners that were working at the time thought that that would be implemented within 2 years, and it wasn't.
And Paul,
Yes.
why do you think the city planners resisted? Because at the moment, the city of Phoenix, for example, in Arizona, is going through a similar sort of awakening process. We could have done this 20 years ago when things were not built out yet, and now they're getting built out and they're trying to move quicker. But was it resistance, lack of knowledge? What were, they didn't know these relationships existed and could garner them? What was behind that?
Okay, you're going to see one of Paul's prejudices, the deeply held belief not founded by facts. And one of my prejudices is that the reason it didn't develop and why technologies on a system-wide level in cities don't develop is because of greed.
Because of greed?
Yes.
On the side of the planning department in the state or the companies?
You name it. They're all participants. It's mayors, it's city councilmen, it's taxi cab owners, it's fire department chiefs, it's citizens, it's business owners along the proposed routes. There's real benefits to having a capitalist society built on greed, and there's some things that don't benefit from it, and city planning and society cooperation is one of them that doesn't benefit as much from that human attribute. And I answer it at such a basic level because what I've found in my career is when you're doing technology forecasting and you're really trying to see the future and you're trying to build system plans on it, if you haven't gotten down to the root cause, you can be badly misled. And you're talking to somebody here who has real experience in trying to put very new technology into companies and into society. And it really, I have made some of my biggest career mistakes by betting my personal and my corporation's money and time on things that I thought would happen a lot faster. I pride myself in saying I was never wrong, but with respect to what was going to happen, but I was just god awful in knowing when it was going to occur. And you look at most technology forecasting, one of you in the class were interested in going into forecasting technology and stuff like that. That's the biggest trick, is to figure out the timing. You go back through history and you look at people forecasting new technologies and things that were going to be, and they usually all happened. It's just that not in time. The one that frustrated me personally, and I cost my last Fortune 500 company a good chunk of R&D money. We thought that voice recognition was going to really come along fast. In the early 90s, that was just, it looked like it was really going to move. And voice recognition has just taken almost 3 decades to get its act together. I mean, really like it now. I can dictate a full page, 250 words, and there'll probably be only, you know, a few of them that are off. But, you know, I still ask Siri and Google and Alexa to do stuff for me, and I get the weirdest answers back sometimes. Straightforward thing. So a
Was
bit
there
of
a,
a tangent, but
was
I
there
don't
a
know if that helps you,
technology?
Tina. Maybe
Yeah, that helps answer that one. Was there a technology that went boom and you didn't anticipate?
The some of the miniaturization stuff, the stuff that was done in the late 90s at the Media Lab at MIT, being able to read people's emotions and and robotics is come a long ways. I mean, the things that you can that they have in Japan are just incredible. I mean, it's the robots have come a long way from a physical dexterity standpoint. Any questions, or does anybody disagree with my assumptions or like to propose another assumption?
No.
Come on, you're PhD students. You're supposed to be getting trained to think out of the box.
My third year.
Okay, well, we'll go on there, but I expect some more interaction.
I would say the idea of multiple parties in the patent technology system. Do you see we'll go with the three big ones you mentioned: Google, Amazon, and Apple. Siri. Yeah, Apple. They don't seem to be coming to a table anytime soon. Is that going to hinder smart city development, or is it going to have to be like a ecosystem-based smart city? So like Tempe is going to be all Android or Google based versus everyone else is going, like each city has to just buy into one. Because I don't see the paywall coming down anytime soon, because as you uh, uh, as you put it, it allowed you to get high margins. So for them to protect their interest, and they have there's no consequence for them not participating other than continuing to maintain a steady growth of profit as opposed to an exponential one or like an extra curve. I don't see any reason to work for that statement to ever come true.
Yeah. So we're going to get down to some conclusions and path forward at the end, but to give you a snippet of it, one of the things that you could argue that cities should do is they should put together huge brainstorming events, and the equivalent of a hackathon, but it's basically inventathon. And what the city should do is sit there and get everybody in the room to agree that they're going to invent for the benefit of the city. And what they're going to do is they're going to sit there and they're going to brainstorm all of the things that they think the future could hold in the way of a smart city. And they're going to brainstorm all the ways in which that could be implemented, because they had a whole bunch of PhD students and as well as just kindergarten kids in the room during these sessions. And they're going to publish the whole thing. And what they're going to do is they're going to make it impossible for anybody to get an advantaged intellectual property position without a license. So there's, you know, so for things that benefit society and that are society based, society needs to way to organize to you know, look out for its own good. Now this is a sort of an out of the box proposal for you, but it's the kind of thing that I think I would expect ASU to be sponsoring. Or, you know, your project is to develop a smart library. As you think of doing a smart library, how can you, you know, how can you capture some of your learnings and make it, you know, capture them for ASU, if you will, but then have ASU put that out broadly to communities. I don't know if that's responsive to your question, but I'm trying to give you an insight about how can you get around this, how can you sort of still work within in the system, but get around the fact that people are blocking.
Yeah, that's fair. And I guess the next point, how do you see, so in your assumptions, the only human side I see in it is the smart city planner. Everything else is technology based. How does that shift go back onto the people side of it? Because the users of these cities have not been represented, or in your assumptions are not well represented unless it's from a planning standpoint.
Yeah, the user step shows up in my conclusions, like I say, because I think that the users have to participate in the technology development, and they can. I'll give you a classic case. One of the 3 companies that I worked for that was a Fortune 500 was Avery Dennison. One of its product lines are office products, basically school supplies. And we had more luck getting kids to invent for us than anybody else. So you basically got broad base. In that case, it was consumers, but the kids would come up with all sorts of societal ideas too. You know, what would make a better program? What would make their school a better place, a happier place? And you get all sorts of stuff. So dwelling and capturing ideas from society is important. And we don't probably have time to go into it today, but the person that Katina mentioned in her introduction, Rick Coleman, started Contenio. And one of the things that Contenio does is it sponsors the San Jose, which is a city here in Silicon Valley. It does budget games, and the citizens now set the city budget. And the reason for that was about a decade ago, the city went 2 years without a budget. There was so much infighting within the city that they actually could not set a budget because people refused to work with one another. And because of that, they decided to have a citizens play a budgeting game. The first year they did it, the council said they would listen to it, but they wouldn't necessarily implement it. When they saw what the citizens came up with, they implemented 20% of the proposals within a week. And at the end of the year, they said they'd wish they'd implemented them all at the end of the week because they all ended up going forward. The next year, they put together the games and they implemented most of the suggestions coming from the games within a month. And now it's a regular part of their planning process. So back to your question about how do you get people involved? Technology to me, you have to know that my PhD's in chemistry, but my minor is in psychology. I really consider the human element a human technology. So when I'm using the word technology up here, when I say patented technology systems, those can be social systems as well.
Paul, did you say you have a PhD in chemical engineering?
My PhD is in chemistry. I should be working for Merck or Merrill or Pfizer. I'm drug design and synthesis by training, but I work my way through because I have a strong electronics background and then written computer programs ever since I wrote my first stock market program when I was a freshman in college. So I got a messy background.
You deliberately leave that out of your CV.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, let's. I'm going to go on then. But does anybody else have a thought about these assumptions? I think they're really important. You should think about the things you are, your careers, and also, you know, what about helping your library and what about your own programs? What I'd encourage you to think about is, even in your own PhD thesis, what are the assumptions you're making?
Is that a question, Paul, you wanted the students to answer?
Yeah, I think it's to be answered when they're writing their thesis. You know, what assumptions. You know, it's just really you you'll have a much more interesting thesis defense if you've thought about that and can throw those out. It tends to your assumptions tend to be the more provocative elements of what you're doing. Okay, I'm gonna. So I want to do, first off, tell me, I do not want to repeat stuff you know and have a good handle on. So with respect to patents, are you familiar, the students there, can you tell me, are you familiar with patents? Do we need to chat about them at all or not? Or just yell out or tell me, as you look at this, is this, yep, got that, know that,
I think we're okay. I think we all understand.
okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good, perfect. So then the two things that I want to point out about this is that you have a time on your right to exclude others from the use of your technology. And so this is what's going to be important when you look about societal incorporation. And what's happened though is that if you think about the popular press, and so I assume most of you have ended up knowing about Apple and Samsung had this big Android, iPhone pissing contest in the States, and you'll notice that they settled for money. They did not settle for the ability to exclude the other company from selling an iPhone. So that should bring a question in your mind. Well, if the patent law says you have a time limited right to exclude others, how come they settled for money? And the answer is because the court decided, gosh, we really can't exclude people who bought cell phones from using them. So society, instead of giving the right to exclude others from using some technology areas, society says you have to do a licensing agreement. We're going to force it upon you as a court. And those damages are actually licenses. Now that I mention this because this really comes into play when we start thinking about smart cities and society's use of intellectual property. So we have the one in red. You get to exclude others from using your technology. And this is what's happening in the smartphone. Siri and Apple and against Google and also Alexa with Amazon. Right now, they're being exclusive. They're not allowing their devices to talk to one another. And the reason for that is the smart home market isn't big enough for somebody to go to court and say, wait a second, it is in society's best interest to make Google, listen to Alexa and vice versa. Since that isn't something that society is saying we have to have it, we're going to go with the red thing. We get to defend it. And what I my assumption was that the use of intellectual property for smart cities is going to stay in the red area for a long time. And back to the question that was just asked to me a little bit ago, well, what do you think can you thwart that? Well, the other way to thwart it, other than brainstorming ahead, is to get society together in large coalitions of public interest groups to force the licensing of technology back and forth to one another. But as an example that I'm going to share with you, it was really the exclusive use of it that stopped radio frequency identification from going forward. Okay, so if courts allow exclusivity, you get to have it, you go the red route. If they require sharing, you got to do licensing. Now the question is if you're forecasting technology, how do you know which is going to fall into which category? And the answer is people have studied technologies, and this is probably, especially for those of you that are looking at groups of technology, this is a unbelievably useful segmentation for understanding how technologies work together, because it's not by the scientific discipline. It turns out that the two major segmentation axes are time to market, whether you need government. I see somebody's taking a picture of it. You're welcome to. Katina's also welcome to share this presentation with you. So
Thanks, Paul.
just to help you out. But feel free to, sometimes I know I take pictures anyhow, just because I want it to jog my memory. So do as you wish. But the two segmentation things are time to market. That is, does it require government regulations to implement technology? And that's where we are with these big system-wide things for smart cities. Does it require industry standards for things working and being able to commercialize the technology? That's where we are with the smart homes, where Alexa will talk to a Wemo switch. So we've sort of got industry standards for talking between some people, but we won't let Google and Alexa talk to the same Wemo switch. It has to be assigned to one or the other network. They're forcing exclusivity there. And then the other thing is just short. You don't need anybody's approval. It's just, does the customer want to buy it or not? Going across the columns, what you see is what's the underpinning for the technology of the industry? And is it science? In other words, you're asking Mother Nature a question. Is it engineering? Yeah, Mother Nature says it's possible, but can you do it safely? It's like you see aerospace up there. It's like, you can make a carbon fiber composite, but if you make a wing out of it, how many times can you flex the wing before it falls off? And so you're up against an engineering problem. And then short is you're just up against a design. Do people want rounded corners on their cell phones for design and ergonomics or not? And depending upon which quadrant you're in, you're going to see some interesting things kind of cluster together that when you look at normal industry segmentations by governments and other people, they don't cluster this way. But these are clustered because when you start to make decisions based on them, one of the things that you see is that intellectual property is used differently by different industries. In the upper left, it's mostly patents. In the bottom right, it's lightly patents, but a lot of branding, trademarking, and copywriting. And in the upper left, you can get broad exclusivity enforced by the courts. And this is what you hear, pharmaceutical and biotech is in that area. And you know that they basically lock everybody out of their compound for their 20 years plus. And then in the bottom right, what you do is you can get exclusivity, but it's for a narrow thing. I can make a Wemo switch with a very specific frequency and a very specific way in which it switches the high load electric circuit on and off, and I can get that covered, but they're very narrow claims. It's not a smart home that I can get a claim on. And in the center is where you have the cell phones, and you've got all of our internet stuff, and where you have those types of environments. And there, as we said in the example I gave you before, ports require sharing. Okay, now the question is, which technologies are going to be the ones that smart cities use? And most of the devices that you require for the smart cities, your video systems, your gunshot sensors, your rain sensors, your oil sensors in sewers, all of this, all the sensor technology, and I include all the video things like that. All of that sensor technology is going to end up in that bottom part, and it's going to end up in the center where the courts require sharing, but only if it's a large-scale societal need at the time the suit's brought. And what I'll argue is that for the integrating systems that the smart cities are going to first start experimenting with, it's not going to be it's not going to be adopted yet in enough cities that society can force the courts to require sharing. So what am I saying? I'm saying the smart cities technologies are mostly going to fall into the area where people are going to get to exclude others. Greed will prevail, back to Tina's question. Okay?
Surprise.
Can you repeat that again, Paul? So smart city technologies will...
You broke up there. Say it again, please.
Sorry, Paul. Could you just repeat that last statement? You said most of the technologies with respect to smart cities will fall into...
Are going to fall into the lower right with narrow exclusivity.
Yeah.
And they'll fall, and some of the integrated systems are going to fall into the center system, the battles for architecture.
Yeah.
But they are not going to be, it's not like, the reason why the cell phones had to be licensed was because there were so many out there at the time, you know, that the technology got way ahead of the consumers and the uses. So if you have a rapidly deploying technology like cell phones, then you end up with the courts, you know, coming in behind and saying, "Oh, okay, well, we can't disrupt it that much." That's not how smart cities are going to develop. Smart cities aren't going to get way ahead of things. If you think about it, it requires government approval. It's going to be long cycle times, and so the people are going to have the lawsuits way before way before there'll be too much adoption. I see a question, maybe.
Yeah. So when you say smart cities, can you give me your example of what the bare bones of a smart city is in your definition?
You say, I got part of the question, but you asked me to define it. Say your question again.
How would you define a smart city? Like, what's the bar it takes for it to become a smart city?
Oh, okay. Well, even what I can see a smart city could easily be from technology. You know, it's everything from, like I say, it's got all sorts of sensors, and you know we've got our, you know, it's got your hearing, your sight, your touch, your, you know, smell. You know, I mean it's as simple as, in our area we've got the fires, so there's you know, we can smell the smoke and we decide that school's dismissed. We automatically send out the text notification to all the parents that the kids are coming home early. It's such like it's raining and we know it's the first rain of the season, and the sensors in the roadway detect the oil slicks and they start reducing the speed limit that they allow the cars. You know, it's you know, for me it is really expansive. It has to do with the safety. It's having the acceleration sensors that were put on the Bay Bridge so that everybody knows, gets 2 seconds of duck and cover time to get under the thing. The acceleration sensors and fire and smoke sensors are in all the buildings, so the fire department is notified immediately which buildings are collapsing and which ones are sustaining damage. And people in adjacent buildings know that the one next to them is in danger of collapse and are told to evacuate. So, I mean, I think of smart cities as being very encompassing, and I say that because, quite frankly, any of us could start a company this afternoon and have the technology deployed and available for sale within months. And you know, it's that's not the issue.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So let me give you. Was there?
Sorry, Paul. There's one more question from Jan.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, what would you say are the main pros and cons of the smart city staying in the narrow exclusivity side of this spectrum versus courts required sharing? What would be like the main problems of these technologies all having their own licenses versus smart cities actually integrating a sharing type of approach?
Okay, so let me see. I'm gonna double check that I heard your question correctly. You're
Yeah.
asking me what's the pros and cons of or say it this way, what's wrong with a smart city being developed like a smart house where you got all the you've got different systems that kind of talk to one another versus versus having to have it all be integrated completely from the start. Did I get the question right?
I think, yeah.
Okay, then I'm gonna use that as a reason to advance to the next slide. I'm gonna show you what happened with RFID, because this is a case. You'd say RFID. What's wrong with having it just? Why couldn't this government have one, and why couldn't Walmart have another? And why couldn't it have developed? So let me try and answer your question with a case study, and at the end of the case study, whether I answered it for you or not, okay?
Okay.
All right. So radio frequency identification, I'm using it as a case study, and what I'm gonna go through is just show you a little bit here about RFID, the technology, market evolution. I'm gonna show you how the intellectual property evolved, and I want to talk about the business implications, and we'll expand it to the question you just asked me about, well, if it's this kind of a thing that's going on for smart cities, how might that future play out differently under the different scenarios? So RFID, they're usually considered tags or label. I don't know if you have the express tollways down in Phoenix. They're basically the toll tags or bridge tags where you sit there and you got it in your car, and they know whether your car is on crossing a toll area or something like that. As I said, it's the thing where you inadvertently walk out with a garment out of a store that's got the tag on it. Some of those are really censored. They're just basically almost magnetic. But then there's other ones that are on cattle, which basically the cow gets the little ear tag at birth, and it identifies the cow, and it's constantly uploaded with which sometimes the data is on the tag, sometimes the data is in the database, which pasture the cow was in and who its mother was and all that kind of stuff. And then so they really range from just present, not present, all the way to summary information. And the logistics chain that was supposed to go in the early 2000s, Walmart was going to have every item in its store have an RFID tag on it. It was put on at manufacture, and it would go all the way through to the consumer. And it would pick up, it was almost a walking blockchain technology, if you think of it in today's terms. You would basically sit there and know where it had been all the way through its product life cycle from birth to death. And the U.S. government, the Army, said that it was going to put in an RFID thing, everything it bought, and they were even thinking about how they were going to do bullets, which was going to be a stretch. But they wanted everything that was bought. They wanted to know, start to finish, what it was. And the advantage of RFID versus just the barcode, of course, is that it's you can scan things at a distance. So the reason Walmart wanted it is I'd walk into their store, I'd throw everything in my shopping cart, and I would just walk past a sensor, and it would read everything in my shopping cart without me moving it. And I just walk through the sensor, and it would say, Paul, your total bill is $196.02, and you know, here's the credit card charge. So that was the promise of the system, and it was technically you could do it. But the things that it requires, if you look at it, they're the attached tags. You start breaking it down. They've got an antenna. There's an amplifier on it. They've got different circuits, the demodulation circuit, the logic processor. You have a modulator, an amplifier, an output antenna. It's sometimes different than the receiving antenna. You really start to look at what kinds of stuff you're putting on the thing, asking it to know about or how it's supposed to respond. Did it have a battery? Not have a battery? So there were lots of different ways in which you can build up a system from components. And the central units had to start thinking about, well, what was the user interface going to be? Was Paul just going to walk through with his shopping cart? Was the shopping cart metal or was it plastic? You know, and all of the things about it. How fast could I walk through it? The thing, lots of different components and different considerations. And in response to this, what happens is that it started evolving from cheap tags to really smart ones, and then there's started ones where the tire manufacturers were going to put an RFID tag on every single tire, so it could track it all the way through, from literally from birth to recycling to death. From a technical standpoint, then, what you see on this slide, it's a little bit tricky here, is you look on the left-hand side and you see all those different technologies that are involved, and you see some of the use cases that you might have for being used in surgery, for instance, at the bottom, and it was their payment made or not paid. And then you look at the chart that corresponds to that, and what you see is it's going from oldest on your right to newest, and this study was done in 2004. What you see is that it was sporadic in the 70s, and then people really in the 90s started deciding, boy, this technology is taking off. So what you have in each of these little sub areas, you've got hundreds of patents, each one unique individual idea. Now, the question is with all this and all these owners, are they going to cooperate? Oh, and this is a system. I mean, these are all, thousands of ideas sitting here. For the system, how are we actually going to make it? Let's go back to our cell phone example. Are we going to make an RFID system or a cell phone? Is it a cell phone? Is it going to have rounded corners or not? If it has rounded corners, does it have a nighttime dimmable display or not? There's just different elements. So it's just with the RFID system. How are we going to do it? Is it going to be powerful antennas and dumb tags that can receive the power, or do the tags have to have batteries and therefore more range? What's the best system for a smart city, as an example? And what you see is that there are some ideas that are just that people have come up with that are the building blocks for others. In my little example, if I invented a cell phone as an example and had a patent on that, somebody else might say, okay, well, I'm going to have a cell phone, but it's going to have rounded corners. We could each have a patent. And this is just double checking your understanding of patents now. We could each have a patent. And the person that I can make cell phones, the person that has the patent with cell phones with rounded corners, they could make it, but they're going to have to take a license from me because they are making a cell phone. So they have to take a license from Paul for the cell phone, and they can make it with rounded corners. I can make a cell phone, and as long as it doesn't have rounded corners, I don't need a license. But if I made even though I have the cell phone patent, if I made a cell phone with rounded corners, I have to take the patent from the other people. So here are what are called choke point patents. Here are the really basic patents that everybody else is building off of, the equivalent of owning the cell phone patent. And in each of these little, if you will, technical subspecialties, all the components you need to build a system, an RFID system, what you see is there's a number of choke point patents that really, if you will need a license from these people to be able to make the component or the use that's specified there. And what you see is there's some 20 odd choke point patents. So out of the 1,000, there's 20 that are choke point that are, you're going to have almost every system will have to have these 20 ideas in them. And let me show you a little bit about what I mean. This is a different visual display of a use, but I want to show you what a choke point patent looks like visually. The choke point patent is shown in the left at the start of the fan by Amtech Corporation. And they had a real-time highway toll collection from a moving vehicle. And that
They had a real-time what?
Go
Could you
ahead.
repeat that? Could you
Yes,
repeat?
it's basically, I just read the title. It's a real-time highway toll collection. It's a really basic patent. So if you're going to collect tolls for moving vehicles, we got the patent on that. That's as simple as that original patent was. Didn't say how it was going to be done, anything else. It's just sort of like, you want to collect tolls for moving vehicles. That's a great idea. It's new, it's novel, never been thought of before. I got the patent on it. In this case, Amtech got the patent.
Was that a process-oriented patent?
I'd have to go back and look at this one, but I suspect it was.
Fascinating. Yeah, fascinating. So that's sort of out of fashion these days, I guess. I've tried to patent a few processes, Paul, and because of recent cases, they've sort of been abandoned internally at SkySong at our innovation sort of hub.
Yep.
So they're more interested in the technicalities of things, but despite what's happening today, it's true that the people like Amtech still are reaping the benefits of the early process, right?
Yep. And what it means is that all the people who you see in the fan, in this case, you've got close to 500 of them, they would all, if they practiced their art, they would need a license from Amtech to proceed.
Yep.
Okay. So
Wow.
they have it from moving vehicles. Somebody may have done it for small cars. Somebody else may have done it for trucks. Somebody else would have done it with an antenna on the top of the roof. Somebody might have got a patent for doing it in the trunk of your car. I mean, I don't, there's just hundreds of variations of this. The point being that this graphic is illustrating is how a choke point patent, you've got, no matter which system ends up getting adopted, it's probably going to need a patent from Amtech. And this comes back to our smart cities thing. If somebody ends up with a patent, and let's just say it was automatic traffic control from moving vehicle input. To Katina's point, I'm not sure I'd get that patent anymore. But if you get a very basic patent associated with it, just about everybody that's using that concept is gonna end up having to get a license from me. And remember, they either have to get a license, or if it's in the fields that we said where the courts are allowing exclusivity, which will probably be the ones associated with smart cities, I can actually stop anybody from deploying the system. And that becomes important here, because what you see, I'm going to show you now a number of choke point patents. This had to do with a use case. This one has to do with the circuitry and how the circuitry is. It's not a chip, it's a flexible package. IBM has this one. If you build an RFID tag that's using thin film technology, need a license from IBM. If it's portable and the barcode reader itself can be moved, then you need a patent from an independent inventor. Just the fact that it's a very specific, this is almost the design patent, a very specific shape of the tag dimensionally, you need another you need a license from IBM. And you start to get the sense of how this thing here, if you're using it to using RFID to find out where it's located. For instance, in the library, the example here for RFID, just think about the library. If all the books had RFID tags, there'd be no need to put books on the shelf in order. You know where every book was located. So you just sit there and when the books came back, you just stick them on the shelf anywhere you wanted to. And when you wanted a book, you just put it, instead of the catalog giving you it, it'd still give you the shelf, but it'd be a random, not a random, but it'd just be a dynamic access system. So inventory systems, using it for inventory, you need to do it for checkpoint. This is the one that got Walmart. They ended up with a disagreement with checkpoint. So another way to look at those, first off, let me just go back here. Are there any questions on how you do that?
Any questions?
How it works? Or choke-point patent and how it works?
No questions.
Okay. Then if you look at a map of all those little technologies that I showed you, and you look at it visually, and you look at sort of who's owning each of the little areas, all the little mountains here represent the technical areas or the use cases. And what you see color-coded are the top intellectual property holders in each of those areas. And what you notice is that Micron has art in a bunch of them, but not all of them, but it's probably the most widespread player in the field. But even it doesn't own all the choke point are necessary to bring out a RFID system. So just looking at this, you can see that the landscape, look at the conclusion, the landscape, technical in the application areas, it's not dominated by a single entity. That means that one industry can't do it. So this is back to the question. So you're going to have to build cooperation amongst people. And that's the situation that I think we're going to find in the smart cities. Later this week, you're going to hear about the lot network, the Internet of Things and stuff like that. That's you're going to hear about probably blockchain technologies and stuff like that. There are areas that are going to look like this. There are a whole bunch of components that are needed for success, and they're going to be owned by different people. Now, the real thing that happened with RFID is there were two of the industry leaders. One was at Checkpoint, one was by Sensormatic, and IBM got in the fray a little bit as well. And what happened is they all wanted to have it be their system, and a couple of them basically ended up, it was going to be their way or the highway, and their other businesses were profitable enough that they actually just had a big enough ego that they just felt like if it ain't going to be mine and not the other guys, then it ain't going to happen, and I think I've got enough clout to do it. And and the reason why I gave you the example of the US government and Walmart, think about how big an industry leader Walmart is. If you got all the RFID tags on everything going through Walmart, and you think about the clout they had over suppliers, you think about the US government with its national security claims and everything else, you'd think that they might have had enough clout to force it. The answer was they didn't. So I just share this example with you to show you how strong intellectual property laws can be enforced. And when people aren't willing to communicate and work together, then you basically end up thwarting the industry. So this comes back to the question that was asked of me before I gave the case study was, gee, don't you think it can work out that people will cooperate? And the answer is yes, but no. Katina said I was basically retiring in at that age. You can probably figure that out from the gray hair. I've seen a lot of executives. I've had the good luck to work in for CEOs in three major companies directly. As part of my role there, I met and spent time with CEOs in large companies all over the world. Um, and then I was also active in the Licensing Executive Society, and in my small company work was basically doing licensing deals with companies all over the world. And what I will tell you is it is unbelievable, and this is back to your social stuff, um, how people will just make bad business decisions based on just personal stuff. It can just be ego, it can be greed, it can just be because they had a bad day. And just because they don't like the looks of the other person or something. I mean, it flabbergasts me, but it is from, again, I'll say, so Paul's prejudiced opinion, remember how Paul defined prejudice, is that it's unbelievable what people will do and will thwart others from doing. And so to do a really good job of bringing out a smart city, then um, I really think, and you start to see my bullet points underneath these things, that city planners today aren't organized. There are associations or professional societies of city planners, but they're not proactive advocacy groups. And my and these are, and now we're getting into ideas, and I'd like to hear some that you might have, and you can think about it and how you might test them with how you're going to help out the library. But how can you start developing standards and having the city planners get the standards out ahead of the industry? What usually happens is if you think about some of the like 5G and things like that, the only time that you can get greed off the table a little bit is to be doing the planning so far in the future that nobody quite knows what it is, but you get everybody to agree to a standard which will define what the system can do. And so somebody asked me, Paul, what do you think a smart city is? And I started to say what it was. Gee, I think it's the ability to have smoke detectors and earthquake detectors and detectors in the sewer deciding to close off sewers when they've got oil, spills in them and stuff like that. It's to get city planners to start writing standards around that, and to have all the cities agree that those are the standards they're going to utilize. And that needs to be on a national, if not international level. And once the standard is, then what you do is you basically tell the industry, just like in the 5G area, if you want to sell a product into this market, you have to give a royalty, either a fair and reasonable royalty license to anybody that's building systems. And basically what that says, all the people that have choke-point patents have to let everybody else use it. And by getting the planning out in front and setting the standards, that would be the way to do it. So it'll be interesting to see. Like I say, the 5G rollout is they did a reasonably good job, but you'll see it's not perfect. There's a huge thing going on right now between the US and China over the two different systems, which ones it's going to be. And now with the trade wars, it's not clear whether it's ever going to be allowed to be aligned, and we're not going to end up in an interesting, two-part world. Blockchain right now, my mind is a Wild West show. There's really no standards in that. IBM's got a system, a whole bunch of other companies have a system. I just saw the latest Gartner chart on their Magic Quadrant, and there's 17 players in basically consumer-driven, systems, of which blockchain is a part, and it's going to be interesting. So, depending upon the relationships, it's going to be fast or slow, but I really think that the people that need to be behaving differently are the city planners, and by city I just mean governmental stuff. So for those of you in the class that were thinking about doing planning, I would suggest that you figure out how you can start getting ahead of this curve. Now you know the advice that I'm giving my own son, so I'm walking the talk here. I absolutely believe this, and that only by a real sea change in the behavior of planning groups, where they're proactive rather than reactive, can real things happen. And that at the least, if for those of you that are thinking about working for companies and entrepreneurial, you should be looking at the kind of patent maps that I shared with you for your own company startups or your own industry, so that you have a really good sense of what you're walking into. Because if you're walking into an area where where the choke point patents are out there, you're at their mercy as to whether you're going to be able to sell your product or not. And I can tell you, as somebody who in other fields held choke point patents, I stopped companies and put them out of business. And that's what you do with intellectual property. And you sure don't, if you're going to start your own company or you're responsible for R&D in a larger company, you want to make sure you're not going to get caught with your pants down after you've spent time and money in trying to come up with something.
So that is an eye-opener to me. I mean, Paul, I've never really considered city planners driving standardization, although on Saturday I was at Phoenix.mobi, a conference that was held here on campus on smart everything. It was on AI, autonomous vehicles, voice recognition, the whole lot, the whole gambit, blockchain. And my talk was on human factors in autonomous systems. I didn't realize at the time, but the CEO and the guy just below her were in my talk from SAE International. SAE sets the standards for autonomous vehicles from 0 to the most autonomous system there is, like 5, right? And she spoke as a keynote afterwards and said that human factors played a huge role in the deployment of new systems into society. And their approach was to go global with the standard. It was to reach out to Europe, to Asia, to the US and South America, Africa, to try and identify a common set of standards by which they could virtually simulate autonomous vehicles and then go from simulation to actual test beds in the real world. Whereas Tesla, if you look at the autonomous vehicle market, just, they don't have an autonomous vehicle, but Musk just deployed the Tesla, gets back the engineering results, puts them back in the lab, figures out the feedback and what it's saying, and improves the system live almost, and there were a lot of people saying how terrible that is, not the electric vehicle, but the live testing. We've seen a few accidents and safety issues with that car. But to bring it back to your conversation, what you're actually saying, because I've ran the mantra for a decade where there was a clear delineation between the planners, and I don't mean city planners, I mean engineering planners, okay. Solutions architects, business case people, and I've demarcated roles in my classes, but actually what you're saying is that we've grown to an education level where everyone now is exposed to technology, everyone is exposed to engineering principles, and what you're saying is the engineers need to be situated within the city planning department almost, or city planners or urban planners with an engineering double degree or something like that, so they can be embedded. Because I can't see, Paul, how the city planners would generate standards. Would they reach out to the engineers to generate the standards, or they would come imbued with engineering background when they became the city planners? Like, what's your perspective with your thoughts? Because I like where you're going with this. I just don't know how it will play out physically.
Well, the thing to remember is that the standards that you want to get in this, and so the thing that I would have with the standards body that you just talked about, autonomous vehicles, they are, in Paul's parlance, a bit reactive rather than proactive. And they are really working on what is being developed and can be, because they're looking for consensus. When you really, to get standards in place early enough that you avoid the intellectual property problems, what you do is you focus on what you want to be able to do. You don't know how you can do it yet. You just have glimmers of an idea, but you write the standard. This standard will be able to transmit this many gigabits per second of data. This standard will be able to detect, 5 senses of information. It will be able, you talk about what it can do. This device will be able to detect the difference between a shotgun and a rifle and a semi-automatic weapon. So you write the standards around use cases. And this comes back to the social engineering. You can have smart people without deep technology background developing the standards. Then what you do is you hold ideations. So there's the one set of ideation session that is really just with the city planners working in community groups. And just to tell you, that's the Bay Area just did scenario planning for the regional area. They developed 4 different things, and what they have is they basically have developed the standards now, given 4 different worlds that might develop: high growth, low growth, sea rise, not sea rise, stuff like that. But by writing what the cities have to be able to respond to is the standard. Now, they don't say how it has to be done. It's just the city has to be able to withstand a 3-foot rise in sea level. Then you start having the ideation sessions with people. Gee, we do it with garbage landfill levees. We do it with high capacity pumps. We do it with putting everybody on stilts. They're just, all, but those become sort of the substandards or enabling standards for doing it. The thing is that if you can get the use case standards out ahead and get people to basically start to agree that in order to basically the requirement for being able to use, if you get to your point, a process patent or a standards patent, and there are some of them that are still available. If you can get that kind of thing, you say, if you want to be able to sell a product, you have to agree to either license it at fair terms or give a royalty-free license. And what it does is at least it stops the ability from somebody to say, I will not license at all. I have the ability to exclude. I want to enforce that. You prevent people from having that position. So the technology people who invented the actual thing, they get a fair and reasonable royalty for it. But nobody can exclude others, so that you don't have RFID some 30 years later still not being deployed. And if you think about it, a lot of the blockchain technology today exists because RFID failed. A lot of the blockchain is really trying to just do, where did this head of lettuce come from that's on my table tonight? What's it been through? What's it refrigeration? RFID would have solved that problem. But because RFID was stalled, people are doing blockchain where all the data is offline. Now, the advantage of having it offline, of course, is you can data mine. So I'm not saying that it's one, but you can really see how when different approaches are thwarted from use cases standpoint, it really changes the development of whole industries.
Can I ask another question? I don't know. First, I'll ask the students. I'd like one question each from you. I know we've kept Paul over time. Paul, do you have time for one question each?
I'd like a question or a comment from each of them,
Yeah.
please.
So actually, one question I was saving and asking, I think you kind of already touched on. I was gonna ask, and I had wondered, so I'm going back to this, which I think you already mentioned though, is for the choke point patents, and you kind of touched on this just now, but if you do remove, I guess, the limitations around them, make them open to use, how does how is it still monetized for the individual who wrote the patent? I guess, how do they ensure they still get money if it's become if it's removed as a choke point patent?
What it does is it's a bit cumbersome. Usually what happens is there's an organization of licensing professionals who are skilled in valuing intellectual property, and they basically come up with a fair and reasonable return for the thing. People either agree to it or don't. Typically what happens is they agree to it. There's also arbitration bodies. Some of them are national, some of them are international. There's a big intellectual property office in Singapore that does a great job of arbitrating, when somebody thinks a patent is worth more or less than another person. In the last resort, when you got lots of money at stake and you just hate one another's guts, you go to the courts like Google and Apple and Samsung do. So, but in that case, the courts do it, and they do it. They use the same methodology. If you're curious about the methodologies used to value patents, you can look that up, and in the reference, the Katina can give it to you. It's in the slide. There's a chapter in one of the draft books that I've got that talks about all the different ways to value it. But that's known methodology.
Okay, thanks.
So I guess mine is more of a future scenario type question. I'm sure you're familiar with NIST, National Standards Technology, the government board. One of the things that I had gone and spoken to one of the folks out there, and his main concern about the digital world was the fact that there is a lot of diverse languages and technology, coding software that is coming out in abundance, to the point where converting from system to system requires a level of, it's not new, it's just making it reshaping the code, reshaping the system so that it can translate between two systems. So my idea was, what's the likelihood of having a top-down approach to set a platform for smart cities to allow corporations and other entrepreneurs to come in that work with the system that's set, so that there's a level of standard already present, but at the same time you have different entry barriers, so that the complexity that you're mentioning or that you're pointing at, there's patented technology systems that are going to have to come into play, and there's a high likelihood of them not wanting to do that. So it's either one's going to win out, or it just happens to turn into a befuddled mess. I was wondering your thoughts on how smart cities would be able to standardize a platform for different corporations to play on the same playing field while providing the services that you consider are worthy of being in a smart city.
So when you talk about technology working together, a good example of one that's worked pretty well is if you think about the USB port on your computer and devices. And you think about how many things you're using them as it was originally a communications port. It's sort of become a charging port more than anything now to power, charge your cell phones. But USB is a common interface that basically it's a communications protocol that allows things. So to your point, you have all this diversity, but in the end, you all speak a specific language and they have a particular way of sharing information in terms of waiting while the other device is talking and stuff like that. So that's the kind of standards that are going to make the smart cities possible. But again, the reason why you want the planners involved is you want to make sure that the way that interface is, the standards for that interface are things that are really going to be meet your use cases. If you're only getting 2 seconds advance warning for an earthquake, you don't want to set your interface standards with a latency of 500 milliseconds or something like that, because so you need to balance use case when you set the standard. So the one thing is I see a lot of people trying to do things like USB, and again, the thing that I've seen most successful is when companies and organizations try and write the standards as soon as they can when they see the future coming, like 5G, and things like that. Because the more you can write the use case before somebody has a particular axe to grind about a particular way they're going to do it, that's when you can reach the most consensus. And then and then to your point, and then after the fact, you really have to wait until so many people are using it that there's a predominance of a standard that then the courts will say, okay, you have to license it. Was that helpful?
Yeah. Yeah. What do you see the advantages and disadvantages of a established city like Phoenix or Portland becoming a smart city versus ground up smart cities like Wayside or Neon?
Well, it's funny. It's in terms of getting it off and running, it's always easier to be start from a green field and get to build it yourself. The thing that I've seen though is that technology changes so fast that you've got this green field and you're 3 years into it and everything's really going hunky-dory, and then all of a sudden this new breakthrough technology comes up, and you're it's like, oh shit time. A classic example to make it real for you, it's around the 2000s or so, if you were building a new home, the biggest thing was to put Cat5 cable throughout the house, so that you had high speed, really good cabling in all the rooms, so that when the internet finally came to your house and everything, and all this nice broadband, you'd be able to get it around, So people start putting all this money into infrastructure. Of course, today you sit there and you just laugh at that because, it's all wireless, So if you think about building your house and you're halfway through building your house with Cat5, and here comes all the wireless technology, it's sort of like, well, you just sunk all sorts of money into you had the advantage that you're a greenfield. I mean, I couldn't, for me to put Cat5 in my house, I would have had to drill holes all over the place and, train rats to wire it for me or something. But it just,
I did that all in '98. We built a house in 1998, put cat fiber everywhere.
Yeah. But I don't know if this is the best example to use, but I think you understand the point. There's pluses and minuses to being old and having to learn how to jerry rig systems and make things work together. And there's advantages to being greenfield, but in the long run, you're only a greenfield for a very short period of time, to be honest with you.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
I guess my question is you mentioned all the cities are going to have to agree on a set of smart city standards, possibly internationally as well. How hard do you think that'll be, given different cultures and environments, and that some cities have already started on the Smart City project.
Okay, I think I've got your question, but could you get closer to the microphone? Your voice was a
Yeah,
little bit
sorry.
garbled.
So you mentioned that city planners are gonna have to develop standards that they agree on internationally and nationally. And I was wondering how hard do you think that process will be given different cultures and environments, and that some cities have already started on the smart city transformation.
Yeah, well, I think to your point, it's not going to be easy. Look at it today. China has started putting in, if you want to look at it, smart cities, where you have basically facial recognition, and you know where everybody is all over a period of time. And that is culturally, there's people that don't think that's a great idea. So I think that's really the biggest challenge. Come back to what I told you before about what I think the thwart was is greed. The second thing is cultural differences and respecting one another's different basic core human values. It's just because you're going to end up with a conflict of values. If you have an earthquake and you know that the building is going to go down and you want the sensors to detonate the charge to cause it to collapse, on itself versus against the building next to it, or is it okay to kill the 23 pedestrians that it knows is on the sidewalk? I mean, those are the kinds of issues that come up when you have standards discussions, especially of a type of smart cities. And so if you want to know a really fascinating field of research, it's around value priority and setting value hierarchy. So you have certain values you live by, and what's the hierarchy that those values will do. It's the thing that Tesla's doing with their cars now. I've lost control. I'm gonna crash. Do I hit the pedestrian? Do I hit the other car? Do I take out a phone bill and kill the person that's in the car? I mean, those are really fascinating areas of research. And if I was your age, I would really be looking at tracking those, because you talk about what's going to guide entrepreneurial company and large corporation products and service offerings in the future. It's going to be a really keen understanding of values hierarchies and what's the same and what's different as you go around to different cultures in the world. So the short answer is, I ain't got an answer for you. I know where to look, but it's not been reconciled yet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jen? So I'm still very interested in your second point on city planners and creating better cooperation for faster or slower implementation of technologies. And although I really think it's very true, much of it is out of the hands of city planners, in the sense because they have to think not only in regulations for the cities, but also about how skeptical the public is of these new technologies and how they should react to that versus, losing the credibility of the public in the government and legitimacy and stuff like that. So as time passes, it is regarded as important more and more that not only city planners and technology and private sectors should work together, but also the academia, as we're doing, and communities, a community-based organization and non-for-profits, in order to really get a representation in the table and make these technologies, making the implementation not faster but more smooth. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yep.
in the sense that it makes more sense to the public to be part of the design process and understanding for what is being used and what is important for them. So there's a weird interaction there between implementing stuff fast or implementing stuff slower, but with more, I don't know how to say this, less resistance from the public, right? Yeah. So I just wanted to know what was your take on, on this of rapid implementation between or slower implementation, and all of these stakeholders that are regarded as important in the decision process. And do you see that even possible, or do you think it's not as important? Yeah, I think my question was like all over the place, but I
That's
hope.
okay. Well, let me give you some thoughts. First off, it's a really important, critical question. The way I look at the question, the answer to the question you've asked is what you need is extraordinary communications skills. And you need to be extraordinary communication skills as being a listener. So you need a whole skill base on how you listen, and you need a whole skill base on how you communicate out. And so if I was interviewing city and regional planners, that's what I would look at. How good a communicator are they? And that's critical. So you've heard the expression, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And if you also think about how ancient cultures were able to transmit information for long periods of time, it was through extraordinary storytelling. So the two things around visual display of information is Edward Tuffy's work on the visual display of things. He's wrote a whole series of books, and it's how can you put in graphics, and today with the computer stuff, how do you build extraordinary graphic displays where when somebody looks at that, they go, oh shit, I know the right thing to do. And the way I started studying, I told you I was in psychology for a while. When I started working for executives, I started figuring out how could I tell the CEO and the executive team something in 30 seconds that at the end of it, they said, oh shit, we know the right thing to do. And the answer is you have to build a really powerful display. And I knew I had the graphic and the PowerPoint slide right when I could show it to my 8-year-old daughter and 5-year-old son, and they could tell me, duh, Dad, what they ought to do is, and that's what you have to create. And like I say, with today's graphic tools, there's a whole bunch of them. If you actually go look at some of the stuff that my son has done, I've been beating on him to do this. You look at some of the urban planning displays he's built, you'll get some thoughts around things that I think are interesting. The other thing is around storytelling. There's an annual storytelling contest, actually. It's a competition. It's held in Nashville once a year. And if you ever have a chance to go to that, go to that. Go find out what it, and just see firsthand what it takes to tell a good story. The real key you want is you want it to be vivid enough. It's like hitting a fry pan with your hand. It's just got to be blasted into somebody's memory so they just see the point, see the pattern in the data, and they know exactly what the right thing is to do. And then when they wake up the next morning or 10 years later, they still know they made the right choice. So that's, again, a bit of a long-winded answer to your question or point, but the whole thing is around extraordinary communication. And I would spend a good portion of my time as a graduate student learning all the different tools to listen well, all the different tools to communicate well. I'd embed them in your thesis. And then the other thing I would do around team decision making, have Katina turn you on to Luke's site, and I'd use the San Jose budget games as a way you can hear a whole city speak and develop concrete, actionable plans with budget dollars attached to them as a result. And those plans go together in hours, not days. So it's about learning that whole tool set is something I'd really encourage you to learn about.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
With your experience in the business world and this space, how do you see our job prospects, careers, after, you know, whether it's hard science, soft science, PhDs in the smart city space? How do you see that playing out over the next, options over the next however many years?
No, I'd love to be your age again. No, serious. It's good. So the answer is you're going into the fourth turning. You're going to end up in a really tight, ugly economic environment. There's an off chance you're actually going to be involved in a global war. It's you know, your working career is really, you know, you're going through the Great Reset. And so, but the answer is there's a whole bunch of money that was made during the Depression. There are a whole bunch of people that did outrageously good social work during that period of time. I mean, to me, the opportunity is boundless. And my best advice to you is back to this thing about building the skill and understanding values and value pyramids, and to learn really well the communication skills. Those will swamp out any others. I mean, in terms of giving you the best chance at a happy and fulfilling life, to me, those two skills and tool sets will out-swamp almost anything else you can pick up.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Paul, we'd just like to thank you and appreciate your candidness and your time. We're just very fortunate to have you actually today. I'm sorry we started late, but thank you for going extra and overtime. But we've taken a lot of notes. I'll close the Zoom in a moment and the recording will download, and hopefully by tomorrow I can share with you a copy. And if I can share it just with the students, because there were just elements that were difficult to hear on our end. This thing is hooked up to record us, and unfortunately we're not using the audio of the lectern. That was the initial issue.
Okay, well, whatever works for you is fine for me. And
Yep.
yeah, and share the other information with the students. And if there's stuff that we brought up that you need more references on, let me know.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a
Thank you.
wonderful day.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye now.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.